The plane of the human. Passing from the plane of animal consciousness to that of the plane of human consciousness, we soon become cognizant of the presence of a new element of consciousness. This element is known as self-consciousness, or the consciousness which enables man to say knowingly of himself, I am. I. To identify himself as the thinker, apart from the thoughts, the actor, apart from the action, the feeler, apart from the feelings, the willer, apart from the voluntary activities, the conscious subject, apart from the phenomena of the senses. It is true that in the primitive forms of human life this new consciousness exists, but as a faint dawn. But it is latent there, and as the ascent of men progresses, this new conscious flames out in higher and still higher forms. What this new element of self-consciousness is, we shall see presently. In thinking of man, we must remember that primitive human beings, little removed from the apes, are as much man as is the highest individual of the race today, or it will be his still higher descendant of tomorrow. And we must not forget that the plane of human consciousness is closely linked to and blended with the plane of animal consciousness at one of its sides. The best scientific and the best occult teachings hold that the man and the ape descended from some common ancestral form in the long ages past. The common ancestor was the trunk from which the man branch sprung on one side and the ape branch sprung on the other. It must not be forgotten that the lowest races of man known to us today are as far removed in degree of intelligence from the highest known types of mankind as from the highest apes or man-apes. In fact, many think that evolution from the highest apes to the Karaf Hottentot or Digger Indian is no more difficult than would be the evolution to those lowly types of human life up to the types of Emerson, Shakespeare, Huxley, Darwin, Edison, and other high types of cultured men. Huxley has shown us that the brain structure of man is compared with the chimpanzee, shows differences but slight as compared to the differences between that of the chimpanzee and that of the lemur. He also shows us that in the important feature of the deeper brain furrows and intricate convolutions, the chasm between the highest civilized man and the lowest savage is far greater than between the lowest savage and the highest man-ape. Darwin, in his description of the very low type of human beings found among the Fuegian savages, says, "Their very signs and expressions are less intelligible to us than those of the domesticated animal. They are men who do not possess the instinct of those animals, nor yet appear to boast of human reason, or at least of the arts consequent upon that reason." Professor Claude, in his description of the primitive man, says, "Doubtless he was lower than the lowest of the savages of today, a powerful, cunning biped with keen sense organs, always sharper by virtue of constant exercise in the savage than in the civilized man, who supplements them by science, strong instincts, uncontrolled and fitful emotions, small faculty of wonder, and nascent reasoning power, unable to forecast tomorrow or to comprehend yesterday, living from hand to mouth on the wild products of nature, clothed in skin and bark, or daubed with clay, and finding shelter in trees and caves, ignorant of the simplest arts, save to chip a stone missile, and perhaps to produce a fire, strong in his needs of life and value and vague sense of right to it, and to what he could get, but slowly impelled by common perils and passions to form ties, loose and haphazard at the outset, with his kind, the power of combination with them depending on sounds, signs, and gestures. The consideration of that characteristic phase of consciousness, known as the self-consciousness of man, will be pursued further in the succeeding chapter, in which chapter will also be taken up the consideration of the two still higher planes of consciousness, known as the plane of the demigods and the plane of the gods, respectively. The three higher planes of consciousness. We have now reached that stage in our presentation of the subject of the secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians, and particularly of that phase known as the 7 planes of consciousness, in which we ask the student to consider those phases of consciousness above the plane of animal consciousness. Accordingly, our present consideration is with those 3 great planes of consciousness, which begin with the plane of human consciousness and include the planes of the consciousness of the demigods, and which find their highest manifestation on the plane of the consciousness of the gods. While these 3 higher planes of consciousness are included in the Rosicrucian symbol of the 7 planes of consciousness, the 7 linked circles, the Rosicrucians have also a special symbol by which they seek to indicate these 3 wonderful high planes of consciousness, the symbol of the 3 linked circles. It will be noticed here also that each of the circles are linked with the 2 on either side of it, the circumference of each circle extending over that of the 2 others on either side. This indicates that each plane of consciousness is blended with the others, a truth which will be made more apparent as we progress, without commentary on the teaching in this chapter. The plane of human consciousness. The plane of human consciousness, as its name indicates, is that plane of conscious activity which is manifested by human beings, high and low, in varying degrees. This plane of consciousness, like all the others of the 7 planes of consciousness, is divided into 7 subplanes, and each of these into 7, and so on, as explained in preceding chapters of this book. Moreover, at one pole, this plane is linked with and blends into the highest subplanes of the plane of animal consciousness, while at its other pole, it blends into the lower subplanes of the next highest plane, the plane of the consciousness of the demigods. Again, following the symbol of the 3 linked circles, the same individual who manifests on the plane of human consciousness is, in a measure, in touch with the 2 higher planes, known respectively as the plane of the consciousness of the demigods and the plane of the consciousness of the gods. The reason that the Rosicrucians place these 3 higher planes of consciousness in a trinity of circles, apparently apart from the lower 4 planes, is that on these 3 higher planes of consciousness, the individual soul manifests self-consciousness, or the consciousness of I am, in at least a certain degree, while on the lower 4 planes, this consciousness of I is entirely absent, and the mental activity is more or less automatic and instinctive. This distinction will be brought out as we proceed. On the very lowest form of human consciousness, the man's mental and emotional activity is but little more than that of the higher animals. In fact, in some cases, the animals actually seem to display a greater degree of intellectual power, though on instinctive lines. But even in the lowest forms of human life, there appears at least a faint glimmering of self-consciousness, or the conviction that I am I, that form of consciousness by means of which the human individual becomes aware of himself as an individual entity. This, rather than the degree of intellectual development, is the characteristic distinguishing mark of the human being. It is quite difficult to describe clearly in words the actual distinction between the highest forms of animal consciousness and the lowest forms of the self-consciousness of the human being, although the difference between the highest animal and the highest man in this respect is quite marked. Admitting the difficulty of the explanation, it may be said that while even in the case of the highest animal, the consciousness is always directed outward, in even the lowest type of man there is at least a faint degree of the inward direction of consciousness. The animal always thinks of outside things, while even the primitive man occasionally thinks of himself, makes himself the object of his own thoughts, in at least the sense of considering his own feelings, ideas, etc., and comparing them with other previously had by him. Or again, there is no inside world or something within to the animal, while man always, at least in some degree, is aware of the inside world, or the something within, as distinguished from the something without. A favorite illustration of the psychologist employed by them to point out the distinction between the simple consciousness of the higher animal and the self-consciousness of the human being is stated by a writer as follows. A horse standing out in the cold sleet and rain undoubtedly feels the discomfort and possibly the pain, for we know by observation that the animals feel both. But the horse is not able to analyze his mental states and to wonder when his paster will come out to him, or to think how cruel it is to keep him out of the warm stable, or to wonder whether he will be taken out in the cold again tomorrow, or to feel envious of other horses who are indoors, or to wonder why he is compelled to be put out on cold nights, etc. Just as a man would do under the same circumstances. He is aware of the discomfort, just as is the man, and he would run home if he could, just as would the man. But he is not able to pity himself, nor to think about his individuality or his personality, as would the man, nor does he wonder whether such a life is worth living. After all, he knows, but does not know that he knows, as does the man. The animal cannot know himself. But we must fall into the error of supposing that the primitive man but we must not fall into the error of supposing that the primitive man, or even the less developed individuals of modern civilization, possess this faculty of self-conscious to a high degree. On the contrary, with both of these types, this form of consciousness may be said to exist merely in a dawn state, and yet the dawn is a distinct advance upon the darkness of the mental night. A modern psychologist says of the comparatively higher forms of self-consciousness, many persons never have more than a misty ideal of such a mental attitude. They always take themselves for granted and never turn the gaze inward. The development of the higher forms of self-consciousness may be noted in the gradual unfoldment of the mind of the young child, for on the mental as well as on the physical plane, the young of the human being rapidly passes through and reproduces the stages of the evolution of its ancestral forms. At a certain stage of the mental evolution or development of the young child, there comes a particular period at which the child seems to awaken to a dawning realization that it is an individual instead of being merely a bunch of feelings and desires. Up to a certain point, the young child speaks of itself in the third person, Johnny, Mary, etc. Then all of a sudden it begins to employ the term I or me in speaking of itself. Though it may make grammatical errors in using those pronouns, nevertheless, there is never any doubt left that the child knows just what they stand for. It knows I am I. Some psychologists call attention to the fact that many children experience a feeling of something akin to terror when they first reach this sense of I, or individuality. Some writers have testified to having felt a strange sense of aloneness and detachment from all other things when this sense of individuality first burst upon them in early childhood. In some cases, the fuller dawn of self-consciousness is accompanied by a newly developed bashfulness, shyness, or that more or less morbid state known as the common name self-conscious. With the faculty of introspection, there often comes a tendency to employ the same too freely, and thus to become morbid on the one hand, or else foolishly egotistical and vain on the other. A writer well says of this particular stage of newly awakened consciousness, although this feeling of separateness and apartness grows less acute as the man grows older, yet it is always present to a greater or less degree until a still higher stage is reached, when it disappears. And this self-conscious stage is painful to many. Many find themselves entangled in a mass of mental states which one thinks of himself are inextricably bound up with himself, and the struggle between the awakening ego and his confining sheaths is very painful in some cases. And this becomes more painful as the individual advances in self-consciousness and nears the end of which he is to find deliverance. Man eats of the tree of knowledge and begins to suffer, and is driven out of the Garden of Eden, of the child consciousness in which the individual has lived like the birds, concerning not himself about the affairs of his higher nature. Man pays dearly for the gift of self-consciousness, yet it is worth it all, for finally he reaches heights of higher consciousness and is delivered from his burden. With the dawning awareness of one's own mental states, one comes to the realization that other human beings possess similar states, and one begins to speculate and reason about the working of these states in others. Then comes the desire to communicate one's ideas to the mind of the others, and to appeal to his feeling or reason. All this promotes the development of intellect and logical thought, which is a marked characteristic of evolving human consciousness. Man begins to seek for an answer to the many whys which are presenting themselves to him, and he seeks to restore from the known to the unknown. He proceeds to invent appliances conducive to the accomplishment of things which lie desires. Oh, that don't make sense. Must be a typo. The accomplishments of things which he desires. He harnesses his intellect to the chariots of his desires and drives it along by command of will, the chariot driver. Man indeed pays a price for this advanced consciousness, as we have said. He pays a constantly increasing price as he advances into the new territory of conscious existence and experience. The more he knows, the more he desires, and the more he desires, the more does he suffer from the pain of not having. Capacity for pain is the price man pays for his advance in the scale, but he has a corresponding capacity for pleasure accompanying it. He has not only the pain of unsatisfied desires for possession of material things and physical wants, but also the pain arising from the lack of intelligent answers to the ever-increasing volume of problems presenting themselves for solution to his evolving intellect, and lie also his pain of unsatisfied longings, disappointments, frustrated aims and ambitions, and all the rest of the list. The animal lives its life and is contented, for it knows no better. If it has enough to eat, a place to sleep, a mate, it is satisfied and asks no more. It has few needs, and while its degree of happiness is not great, it lacks the capacity for mental and emotional pain possessed by those higher in the scale. And many men are but little above this stage. They are easily satisfied. They are ignorant of the unsatisfied desires which render others unhappy. They have no unanswered questions. They do not even dream of the existence of such questions. But as man progresses, his wants multiply and his pain increases. new wants are but partially satisfied, and the unsatisfied remainder bring pain to him. Civilization becomes more and more complex, and new wants and lacks manifest themselves. Man attaches himself to things and creates for himself artificial wants, which he must labor to meet. His intellect often fails to lead him upward, and too often merely enables him to invent new and subtle means and ways of gratifying his senses, in a way impossible to the animals or primitive man. Some men make a religion of the gratification of their sensuality and their appetites, and sink below the level of the beast in this respect. Others become vain, conceited, and filled with an inflated sense of the importance of their personality. Others become morbidly introspective and spend their time analyzing and dissecting their moods, motives, and feelings. Others exhaust their capacity for pleasure and happiness by looking outside of themselves for happiness instead of within. These are the dark shadows cast by the bright light of human consciousness. However, the shadows always found as the opposite of all real evolutionary progress. As man progresses in the scale of self-consciousness, however, he finds himself gradually detaching his sense of the self from its sheaths and working tools. He begins to realize that there is an I am within his being, to which all the feelings, the emotions, the desires, and even the thoughts and ideas are but incidents. In this high stage, he perceives himself to be an I am surrounded by his mental and emotional tools and belongings, a sun surrounded by its whirling whirls and activities. He realizes that the ego is not only superior to the body, but also to the mind and feelings, and he learns now only how to master and intelligently use his body, but also how to intelligently master and use his intellect and his emotions.